Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks everybody for coming on board. I think today is going to be very special and interesting and hopefully entertaining for us all. As you know, this U3A business is a worldwide phenomenon. And in France, where I believe it all started, the system differs completely because most of the French U3As are affiliated to universities. Some are sponsored by universities. So it's a university-based U3A. Ours is much closer in format to the UK, where U3As are sort of independent and they're operated to suit the needs of the locality. And it may surprise you to know that in the UK, there are well over 1,000 U3As. So now, why am I rambling on like this, you may ask? Well, there's a common theme amongst us human beings, and that is we like to explore and we like to widen our field of activity. It's a natural human desire. And today is really the result of this desire to expand our interests, to reach out and to explore. So we recently made contact with Tim Ewbank, the chairman of Cambridge U3A, to see how or if we could collaborate in some way across the water and to gain on both sides. The Cambridge U3A, which I won't talk about in detail, but it's amongst the largest and amongst the oldest of the U3As in the UK. I was absolutely delighted that Tim responded positively, and thank you, Tim, to this overture. It'll be an exciting event if we can manage the 2,300 members that the Cambridge U3A has on a regular basis. Anyway, Tim is going to be talking to us via Zoom from Cambridge. It's a special thanks, Tim, to you. So instead of me introducing you, I find it quite difficult to try and talk about somebody else who I don't know. So it's much better if I could just ask you just to give us a little insight to who you are and how you're going to enlighten us today. And we honestly thoroughly look forward to this experience, Tim. So over to you.
Thank you very much for this invitation to your year-end event. I do have an African connection in that I was brought up in Rhodesia, as you could tell, quite a long time ago. So memory is fading a little bit, but I've been backwards and forwards many times. My parents stayed out in Zimbabwe until the millennium. On one of those visits, I did come to Hermanus to visit some emigre Zimbos who managed to get themselves very fortunately to Hermanus. So that's just a bit of personal background. In terms of my professional background, my working life was principally in management consulting around technology. And I worked for a number of different consultancies and then companies, and one of which was a biotechnology company, which brought us to Cambridge about 30 years ago, myself and my family, and been here ever since. If I move from that to the subject for today, social media is such an all-encompassing technology, it's probably useful for me to say how I use it, because how I use it may be different from how you use it. Specifically, my personal view is I don't really use Facebook very much. Because I'm talking about this subject, I need to be aware of it, but for reasons that I'll explain, I'm very cautious about my use of Facebook. And similarly with Google, I don't use Google as a search engine at all. I use something called DuckDuckGo, which doesn't track you. I don't use Twitter, and for different reasons, I don't use Amazon. I feel Amazon has an unhealthily large share of the marketplace. And so I choose to take my business elsewhere, just my way of context. So having said that, sort of giving you a little bit of a personal perspective, and then what my view is of technology. As I say, I've been a watcher for many years, but I use it in a deliberately selective way. For reasons partly concerned with privacy, as I said, in relation to Google and Facebook, and then the sort of monopolistic aspects of Amazon that I think are unhealthy for the marketplace. So having said that, let's move on to the subject for today, which is the impact of social media on democracy, and obviously brought very much to the fore by what happened in the US, as per this banner slide, the riot on the 6th of January. This slide was not one I made, conjured up by someone else. These are the leaders of all the big technology companies who were called to a Senate hearing, and which is in fact still going on, to explain what influence their systems their applications had in terms of the organizing of the riot. And the lady in the right-hand corner's name you may be familiar with, Frances Haugen. She's a Facebook whistleblower who came to public attention just over a month ago, and I'll talk about what she has exposed in relation to Facebook's behavior. So why is all this important? Plainly, it's all around us. First of all, social media is in everybody's lives and it's fairly addictive. I've got a couple of quotes here about why this is important. So this is from President Biden's inaugural address. He said there are 6 crises the US faces: virus, climate, growing inequality, racism, global standing, all of these things being diminished by his predecessor. But most importantly, the attack on truth and democracy, this idea that we can all have our individual truth, which is really the next point. This is President Obama said, if we can't tell black from white, essentially, we can't agree a common set of facts if we're going to debate, our democracy doesn't work. And that's sort of the situation that increasingly seems to be moving into. People claim to have my truth, as though somehow truth is a personal construct rather than something that we can all agree on. And then lastly, a quote from this company's, a political risk analysis company, said Facebook's business model is fundamentally incompatible with social democracy. And I'll explain a little bit about that. And it's partly because it never intended itself to be a political instrument of any kind. It was a private organization set up for the benefit of its shareholders. I'll come back to that in a moment, and you'll see why that's still a very valid comment. So the structure of my talk, I rather like this as the structure of a talk. It's from apparently it's a Polynesian proverb. Anyway, it could be from anywhere. So to know where we're going, we have to know where we are. To know that, we have to know where we came from and how we got here. So I'll start with a little bit of the background, just an intro to where we are, and then a little bit of the background, and then what it's led to in terms of the current situation in relation to the impact of social media, and then beyond that, what, if anything, needs to be done about it. A couple of definitions. Definition of political democracy. There are volumes written about this, but being from Cambridge, I thought the Cambridge Dictionary would give us the definitive answer. So I've just picked out this quote, and the clause that I've highlighted or emphasized in black is really the crucial one. So the belief that everyone in the country has a right to express their opinions, and that power should be held by people who are elected, or a system of government based on that belief. And the critical part of this in relation to social media is that everyone in the country has the right to express their opinions. And the critical thing about social media, as I'll demonstrate, is that social media impacts who sees what information you see, and that implies who gets heard, what decisions are algorithmically made about the information that's served up to you. Information is not universally free to everybody. So what do we mean by social media? You'll probably recognize some of these logos. What I'm going to put now is the logos of the leading companies. So Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and Instagram. This is the Chinese one, WeChat, TikTok, which is the short video clip sharing service, and then Twitter, which is relatively small, which is why I've made the icon quite small, but became so much more prominent because it was President Trump's. The crucial thing about this, and you'll recognize that, and there are obviously others as well, but the most important thing is that those 4 are all owned by Facebook. Right? If you just think about that, those 4 companies, the 4 market leading companies, you look at this list here on the right-hand side. So of the top 5 social media companies, 4 of them are owned by Facebook. And the only one that isn't is YouTube. And I'll talk separately about them in a moment. So in the last set of statistics that I saw, in any one month, something like 2.4 billion people actively engage with Facebook. This is a third of the world's population. So in terms of its influence in the information that it passes on and shares and spreads and so on, is absolutely massive. In addition to that, Facebook itself is basically Mark Zuckerberg, the chief executive. So he owns something like 28% of the shares, and is obviously one of the wealthiest people on the planet, just by the way. More importantly, he has a disproportionate number of preferential shares. So he actually has 60% voting rights. So the company is Mark Zuckerberg, effectively, in terms of policy. So there's a scary thought that he is actually probably the most important media mogul on the planet. So where are we now in terms of the use of the internet? I don't want to make out the story. It's all bad by any means. Facebook, social media, and the internet have enabled a great many things that wouldn't otherwise have been possible. Not least the fact that this extraordinary young woman from Pakistan, Malala, came to prominence through the internet and probably wouldn't be alive and would certainly have been suppressed and repressed in Pakistan. So another example example, we now all get our news feeds, these extraordinary images of flights going out of Afghanistan, the last flights, and people just milling around on the airport. So live streaming of events, which is, in terms of news, it's just what the way the world is now. The Comet Pizza Parlor, I will talk about that. Conspiracy theories, they're somewhat less good, but extraordinary stories can get blown up on the internet. And this another example of live streaming. This is the African-American who was killed, George Floyd, provoked the Black Lives Matter. And the live streaming of the 9 minutes in which he was being held down by a policeman's knee on his neck, it was undoubtedly the crucial piece of evidence in the policeman's trial. And then, of course, there's the most egregious incident was the storming, the riot, whatever, insurrection in the Capitol on the 6th of January, which the Republican Party is still trying to play down, make out they were just over-enthusiastic tourists. None of these things would have been able to happen if we hadn't had social media in the form in which we have it today. So you'd have to say it's in a completely unexpected place. And one of the things I should have said at the outset, I've struggled with this in this talk, to kind of make a connection to Southern Africa, because you're in our news very seldom, though you are this morning by coincidence. So there's not much I know about social media in South Africa, but I have got one example for you from a little while ago, from 2013. You may have been aware of the discovery of an early hominid in the Rising Star caves just outside Johannesburg. Our paleoanthropologist Lee Burger made this extraordinary discovery, or it was brought to his attention. But crucially, the bit that's relevant to social media here is through being able to use the internet, he was able to find and recruit a small team of cavers who were very specialist. They needed to be paleontologists, they needed to be physically small, by which, as it happened, 6 people he recruited were all women, and they needed to be speleologists in the sense it was a very difficult descent into the cave to actually be able to get in and do proper scientific work and bring out all the remains. And that was something that certainly would not have been able to happen if he hadn't been able to use Facebook as the means through which he put the message out, and it gets passed, it gets shared from one to another, and then he was able to find people. He got, understandably, from South Africa and some from Australia, 2 Canadians and an American. So that was an example of how social media has directly impacted on this small area of scientific study directly in South Africa. So how did we get here? Because it all started so optimistically in the heady days of the 1990s. Facebook's slogan, be connected, be discovered, be on Facebook, by implication, be cool. And the internet mantra was that information should be universal and free, and that would generally improve the public discourse and people's awareness of what's going on. And implicitly in that, given that this information was going to be free, there was we call it a social contract with the users, that the service was free in exchange for what was in those days described as digital exhaust. In other words, waste material. As we'll see shortly, it turns out to be digital gold dust. So how did we move from these heady euphorian days of the idea of information is going to be free and the world is going to be a better place, to where we are now, where social media has really become the digital junk food of our age, in the sense that it's cheap, it's ubiquitous, it's very appealing, but it's probably not particularly good for our health in a number of ways. So a couple of milestones along the way, the things that enabled this, the catalysts. Probably one of the most important was the smartphone. So starting with the Apple iPhone, the idea of the touch screen and being able to swipe across the screen so you can move very easily between segments of information. Reality TV, the influence of individuals, particularly to attract public attention and attract people to them and then pass on information, the influence that they've had on other people, and Donald Trump himself being a particular example, and there are plenty of other so-called celebrities. This initial study is a study done partly in Cambridge and partly in the US, was really important because one of the things that they discovered, and this is going back, I think, 10 years or so, they discovered that by analyzing the likes that people identify on Facebook, it was possible to profile people with an astonishing degree of accuracy. Collecting up the pattern of likes that people and responses to things that they saw on the internet, they were able to profile people, and they did an experiment to do it basically in real life versus on social media, and confirmed that this is actually the case. Literally as many as 30 likes, there will be, algorithmically, there will be some measure of how you fit into another comparable cohort. So one of the things I never do on Facebook is I never like anything. I observe, and you could say I'm something of an internet lurker, but I make sure I don't give anything away unnecessarily. Algorithmic newsfeed. So from these cohorts of recognizing your profile and how you fit in with other comparable groups, and also things like your browsing history, your searching, your purchasing history, you algorithmically, it will determine what news feed is provided onto your screen. So we're now all seeing personalized news story. And you might be interested to do that as a family. You know, you both, so a couple, both enter the same question onto one of a search engine and see if you get exactly the same responses, because that's an indication of how personalized these news feeds have become. Creation of groups was, in a sense, a good idea because it brought people of like mind together. However, that was a good thing and a bad thing in the sense that it enabled people to get in touch with one another, like the example from the Rising Star that I mentioned. But also, it has enabled things like conspiracy theory groups and hate groups and racist groups and so on, people who have less than healthy interests to find each other and then broadcast messages backwards and forwards to one another. So they get into these little echo chambers where all they hear is a reinforcement of whatever it is they believe in the first place. There is never any counter argument. So in some cases, it can have the effect of spinning things down. The Facebook contagion experiments, these are really interesting. This is where you move from what do we know about people to actually changing people's behavior. I refer to as the contagion experiments, where it deliberately changed people's news feeds from two cohorts, one of which received positive news and positive messages, and the other one received rather more negative messages, and how their behavior changed as demonstrated by their subsequent messages, pattern of likes, and their interaction with the networks, interaction with social media. So you saw that people were actually changing their behavior. And the most real example of this is something, again, going back about 10 years ago, was something called Pokemon Go, which was a little company set up and spawned by Google. You may remember, I'm sure you won't have played it yourself, but maybe your grandchildren did. Basically follow a digital path around the real world in which you picked up digital tokens. And they found that people were very interested in this. It got much more traction than people expected. And then, not surprisingly, given that this is principally a commercial operation, they were able to route people who were following the Pokemon Go route past places who were paying for advertising. So you were routed past the local burger shop or the local Christmas present bazaar or something, whoever it is was paying for the advertising. So they found that it was really not that difficult to change people's behavior in the real world as a result of things that they saw on the screen. And as we'll see in a moment, these things have been applied in the political arena as well. So social media's business model has been academically analyzed by this lady, Shoshana Zuboff, who's written a really interesting book, what she refers to as surveillance capitalism. But however, it comes with a health warning. It's about 700 pages. So you need to be really interested in this subject to read the whole thing. However, she has done a couple of very good YouTube lectures. And I have at the end of this talk, I've got a short list of references. The key thing that's part of Shoshana's argument is this, that basically she refers to it as surveillance capitalism. So first, private personal experience is the raw material for these attention engines, the social media and social media. So the raw material is obviously your use of Facebook, your likes, your groups, your members, but it's everything else as well. So it's your browsing history, it's probably your purchasing history, it's your phone history, it's the telematics out of your car. All this data can be collected and aggregated, and there are third-party companies who will buy packages of data, aggregate them, and then sell them on to people to advertise. And crucially, what these packages do is they provide predictive models of human behavior. So from looking at your individual profile, there will be another cohort of people who are so closely identical to you, you can see how it is they behave. And with just a small nudge, it will be possible to encourage you to do things that you might not otherwise have been thinking of doing. And for the most part, that means buying stuff. And they refer to her term for this is behavioral surplus. She refers to it as a one-way mirror in the sense that the people who can see the analytics behind your behavior know more about you than you do about them. This is a really important message, that the users of social media are not the customers. You're the user, you're not a customer. And I'll show you that in a moment. So there's an asymmetry of power. Social media companies know more about you and how you're psychologically motivated than you may be aware that you know yourself. As a result, her term is to become behavioral modification engines. And the surveillance dividend is the extent to which you can be nudged into doing things that you would not otherwise have done, which provides some commercial benefit. And this is the crucial message to best. It was always useful to bear this in mind. If you're not paying for the product, it's because you are the product. Anything that you tapped onto a keyboard has been collected up somewhere and being put into a profile of your behavior. This is fundamentally the problem for social media. As I said, they're commercial organizations for the benefit of their shareholders. And their key criteria are engagement, where engagement means how long are you on the platform? How long can they persuade you to stay continually using whatever the application is, and how frequently you come back again? And their overriding concern is to keep you using the platform. So they're constantly giving you a stream of prompts, suggestions, retweets, likes, reactions, shares, news feeds, anything. And with the screen swiping, it makes it ever so easy for you to flick from one thing to another and just stay on it. And the more time you're spending, the more data is being collected about you. This is a really important point. They just discovered quite early on that the more contentious the material is, the more likely it is to be shared. It's an old story, and good news isn't really very interesting news. It's the bad news that makes the headlines. And the difficulty, and this is a particular point in relation to Trump, the conundrum that Facebook has in relation to Trump is he is a huge revenue earner for them, in the sense that the Republican Party placed a lot of political advertising. He was their biggest single advertiser around the election. And also he drives huge numbers of users to the platform. But on the other hand, he's promoting hate speech and antisocial behavior and all sorts of things. So where do they strike the balance? And the answer was they took ever such a long time. And it wasn't until after the insurrection that they actually did anything about it. The point of using that example is that highlights the difficulty that they're having, that Facebook is having with this. It's a commercial organization, and yet the activities of people who are using their platform is causing real social harm. And the company has been able to minimize its moderation efforts of moderating the content by claiming that the right to freedom of speech overrides the needs for balance or accuracy. And I'll explain why social media companies don't have the same responsibility as newspapers in terms of fact checking. So here are 8 ways in which social media impacts on democracy. Firstly, it's decimated the print and media industry. It was going down anyway, but they've accelerated the trend. The algorithms determine what we said, as I mentioned already, enables the rapid spread of disinformation. I've got several examples, including coronavirus. It polarizes and divides rather than builds consensus, undoubtedly. Trivializes debate into sound bites and images. The fear of pylons, flash mobs and pylons weakens public debate, and used in elections, both in the US and in other countries. And in the particular issue in the UK, the use of social media applications is the accountability of our politicians. But it does help us get connected. If you go back to the original intention, we are much more connected than we were before. So in terms of the impact on social media has decimated the print news, or it has happened in the time of the rise of social media. I can't say it's entirely due to them, because it was going on anyway. I mean, local news was diminishing through the internet. Unfortunately for the newspaper industry, they made a pact with the devil by agreeing to make their content available through social media in the hope that that would drive the reverse connections back to their sites. And in fact, the social media companies just used it as a hook to keep people on their website. But the crucial thing is 70% of advertising revenues are now through Google and Facebook. And Google's advertising revenues are massively higher by a couple of orders of magnitude than Facebook. Keep just going back to what grabs the headlines. You've ever seen this film called The Nightcrawler? This is just a film about the principle that if it bleeds, it leads. It's the horrific stories that get the headlines. The alternative in the digital world, or the corollary in the digital world, is if it offends, it trends. The more contentious the material is, the more likely it is to be copied and retweeted. And there was a study by, I think the MIT study, they looked at something like 120,000 tweets over a 10-year period, and that contentious material was something like 10 times more likely to be passed on, and passed on more quickly than relatively bland, purely factual information. And one of the consequences of the decimation of the newspaper industry is that there are fewer recognized sources of independent news. There are relatively few that can now be accepted as independently authoritative. Firstly, there are fewer of them, and they've become more partisan. So these algorithms that determine how we use, I've described some of them, but here's an example. You'll recognize these. These are Facebook likes and reactions. So the like is the left-hand little blue thumb, and then these are a series of increasingly strong reactions. And the stronger your reaction, the more likely it is someone is going to firstly read it and secondly pass it on to someone else. These are used in Facebook to prompt the next thing that you're going to see. The more strongly you react, the more you'll be fed more of the same kind of material. And YouTube recommendations work in the same sort of way. Because YouTube is another one of these so-called attention engines. And it's plenty of evidence that YouTube in particular is used in the radicalization of people into either Islamic groups or hate groups of one sort or another. And certainly the alt-right use it significantly in the US. And it's all based on the principle of comparative cohorts. They've got such huge amounts of data. Whatever combination of personal circumstances you have, they will have a cohort of people who are similar to you, whose behavior, who might be a few years older or further down the use of social media. So they'll be your use based on other people similar to you. Okay, disinformation and conspiracy theory. There's a distinction between misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Misinformation is stuff that's just plainly wrong. Disinformation is stuff that's wrong, but with intent, intentionally wrong. And a conspiracy theory usually has a reason why behind it. So this first came to widespread attention with, obviously not completely new, but through social media, the crash of the Malaysian Airlines in 2000, I think it was 2013, was shot down over Ukraine. The Russian cyber organizations produced such a cloud of conspiracy theories about why it was happened, conspiracy theories based on conspiracy theories, mocked up maps, all sorts of things to basically so muddy the waters that no one really knew what happened. It gave them deniability. The second one, which was in a much bigger issue, obviously in the US, was the so-called Comet Pizza Parlor, which was alleged by the biggest and most virulent conspiracy organization in the US, QAnon, to be the headquarters of a den of, I think they were cannibalistic pedophiles, all of whom happened to be Democrats, who were the deep state that basically controlled the US economy. They were all centered in this pizza parlor. I mean, it sounds just too extraordinary to be believable, but anyway, it was a real story. And I'll say a bit more about QAnon in a minute. And then in the UK, another example of the same thing was the poisoning of this gentleman on the right here, Sergei Skripal, who was a Russian emigre in the UK and who was poisoned with Novichok. And again, the Russians poured out so many conspiracy theories about why it could have happened to try and muddy the waters. I mean, there was not much doubt that it was Russian agents who did it, and there was some pretty compelling evidence. But it was just the way that the Russians were able to basically muddy waters. And they refer to these things as political technologies. And from their point of view, in terms of the objective of destabilizing the West, they're fantastically good value because it doesn't cost very much to generate conspiracy theories and spread them around. But they're pretty effective in terms of distracting and confusing people. And this is a sort of summary of that. You know, a lie can go around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And certainly the correcting of lies and misinformation is, firstly, it's impossibly slow, and usually the news agenda is so fast moving that people have moved on and forgotten about it. So some of the original dirt sticks. So an example of conspiracy theories in the pandemic in social media, but I'll just start with this extraordinary story of this chap here, so Tom Moore. He was 99 and he set out to walk up and down his garden 100 times to raise £1,000 with his little walker, pushing it along. But for some reason, he just captured almost the world's imagination, because instead of raising £1,000, he didn't raise 1,000 or 100,000 or 1 million. He actually raised £32 million, which he then donated to the local hospital charity. So this is some of the good that social media does. But coming back to the more important thing, vax hesitancy. I don't know how big an issue this is in South Africa, but certainly it has been an issue here. It's diminishing to an extent. But in the UK, so the BAME, Black, Asian, Middle Eastern population, is twice as likely to be infected and 4 times more likely to have serious diseases for a whole range of social and medical reasons. But the BAME community is about 20% less likely to take up the vaccinations over the rest of the population, even among health workers, though that's changed, but we've now mandated that health workers must have a vaccine. And in the US, this strange organization, QAnon, has morphed itself into an anti-vax organization, which has joined up with the wellness movement, body purity, and they are all resistant and very vocal in their resistance to the vaccination, despite the fact that over 700,000 people have died by October. So it'll be more than that by now. And that if you're unvaccinated, you're 10 times more likely to die. And yet it still goes on. And I think we're probably at the stage in the pandemic where everyone's made up their mind one way or the other. The chances of people who are resisting vaccinations now deciding that they it was all a big mistake and to take one are probably quite limited. And even at the moment, so I don't know about South Africa, but in the last week, there have been protests against vaccination mandates in Belgium and the Netherlands. One of the other things that social media does is it reduces the political discourse. It both coarsens it, certainly in relation to Donald Trump and his obscene tweeting, but also to images. Here he is trying to be on the side of the angels holding a Bible up in front of a church. And our Prime Minister can't resist looking like he's doing real work on a building site, getting himself into a high-vis jacket and a hard helmet. And other little phrases like this: we took all the right decisions at the right time. This was in response to criticism of how slow the government was to respond to the initial pandemic. And this particular phrase apparently has a historical resonance in the US. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. And the point about this is that it's much more difficult now to hear a reasoned debate about any particular subject, other than if you read the right newspapers or articles. So much of it is reduced to sound bites and images. Another thing that goes on, certainly in this country, so-called flash mobs or monstering people on the internet. And the biggest social issue here, the most contentious, I should say, is transgender. So there's these two people, Germaine Greer, whose name you probably know, and J.K. Rowling, both of whom made what were deemed to be derogatory comments about transgender people. And they got absolutely monstered on internet, on social media, such that particularly they were both had invitations to speak withdrawn as a result of their comments. And that's just got to be unhealthy for democracy, that you can't have a decent debate. Another really contentious issue is race. So this lady, you may know, she's certainly written a couple of books. She's a foreign correspondent. She's written a couple of books about Zimbabwe that I've read. So she's a very highly respected international correspondent. But she made essentially a flippant comment in relation to the death of Prince Philip, who was notorious for making slightly off-color remarks. And she got absolutely, again, monster on social media as a result. And the people who go after particular individuals, they will go back to, so they went back to Christina's publisher, they went back to her university, to her employer, and basically made a very loud case against them, partly by way of signaling their own virtue and the purity of their thought and so on. But the crucial thing about this is your attitude will probably depend on what you think of the issue. If you have strong views about transgender or race, you may feel that they don't have a right to say them, speak anyway. But I think from a democratic point of view, this idea of deplatforming is deeply unhealthy. Now let's move on to how this is used in elections. You may have heard of Cambridge Analytica. It was an organization who was involved in elections in a number of countries around the world. And some of their tactics were exposed in 2016 by a whistleblower. The fact that they'd used data which they'd got by doubtful means from about 50 million Americans, on each of whom they had multiple data points. And they were able to segment the electorate into very small groups and target individual messages. So these micro-targeting of messages. And they usually do one thing or the other. They could segment groups, and the example they gave was one of the Caribbean islands, the distinction between, I think there were Western Caribbean and Asian, and one group they were trying to encourage to vote, and another group they were trying to suppress through the advertising and the promotion of local groups to do that. And the crucial thing about these adverts is they're very transient. So they weren't in the paper, they were basically through the internet and over social media. And after their expose, the company was wound up pretty quickly, and they claimed involvement in the 2016 US election, though no one had any interest in investigating. And that's one of the problems with these things, that people who've used these tools and have done so successfully such that it's brought them to power, have no interest in investigating the fact that they may not have been entirely above the line. And Brexit in the UK is a case in point. There was a massive disinformation campaign, including this notorious bus here. But the thing that really resonated was these adverts that basically played to people's fears and anger, and specifically immigration. And there was a completely erroneous disinformation campaign about the fact that everyone in Turkey was thought to want to come to the UK, 78 million of them, which was complete nonsense. They weren't even in the EU and they weren't even being considered. But nonetheless, the adverts were put out there because the sums of money spent on advertising for our elections are controlled on print media, but not online. So they're able to use as much as spend huge sums of money. And if anyone's interested in this, this is a really good TED talk. And again, this is one of my references at the back, a lady called Carol Cadwallader, who was involved in the Cambridge Analytica expose. She did a short talk, a 15-minute TED talk about some of the activities that went on around the EU referendum. In the UK, there's a big issue with the accountability of our government. This is a funny little cartoon here based on My Little Pony, My Little Crony. The fact that government ministers have been using encrypted message apps like Signal and Telegraph and WhatsApp to conduct government business, which is actually illegal. But crucially, it's to do with lack of transparency in procurement for huge sums of money, and as in billions of dollars overall, for PPE contracts without due process. And our information commissioner is trying to find out what it is that's gone on. But because they're all on private phones, many of which have been messages have surprisingly been deleted, it's going to be a difficult thing to do. But again, it just adds to the same thing about the erosion of public confidence in the government. Coming now to Frances Haugen, who's the lady I mentioned earlier, Facebook whistleblower, who showed from the data that she documents, huge number of documents. She was a very credible witness. She was not a disgruntled, fired employee. She was in quite a senior position, and she systematically collected a lot of information about the harm that Instagram did, particularly to teenage women, teenage girls. But more importantly, what we're talking about here is their international moderation is very weak. The ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar was being live streamed by some of the soldiers over Facebook. And she said that during this period, Facebook didn't know quite how to deal with this. And by the way, they only had one person who could speak the local language who was trying to moderate this absolute torrent of material, and multiple languages, as there are in many parts of the world. So Facebook's attempts to moderate internationally are very patchy. Her key message, her soundbite, was profits before safety, which of course Facebook have tried to deny. Okay, so let me quickly just summarize this. So social media, specifically Facebook, has been a success beyond anybody's expectation, but it's had some unexpected consequences. The algorithmic moderation, crucially, does not create consensus. It drives things the other way. Our political debates become very transient and reduced to sound bites. Flash mobs have this dampening effect for fear of online retribution, which is very unhealthy for debate generally. And our trust in authority is generally diminished as a result of the consequence of these things. So where is all this going? In the US, the risks is internal, so particularly alt-right hate groups are seen as a much bigger risk than international terrorism. There's a never-ending series of privacy breaches from Facebook. I rather like this, as my dad says you're spying on us, to which Mike Zuckerberg says he's not your dad. Anti-competitive behavior, so that's monopolistic behavior. They have such a powerful hold on the market, and they were operating a buy and bury strategy on small startups. The unethical behavior in relation to the example I just gave about the impact of Instagram on teenage girls in terms of depression and anxiety. And self-regulation, there have been various attempts at self-regulation. So the Facebook Oversight Board, for example, which is an international group of people who are supposed to adjudicate on particular tricky policy issues like should Donald Trump be allowed back on the platform, to which they said, well, we need some policy guidelines. So they basically punted it back to the company. So it's not done anything useful yet, but it's relatively new, only started this year. Okay, so where are we going? Facebook is continuing to expand. It's expanding into religious groups, which is a little bit scary. They were developing a junior Instagram, but that's stopped as a result of Frances Haugen's expose. Increasing surveillance. This company, Clear AI, has world-leading facial recognition software. And that's being increasing, and deep fakes, where it's possible to make it look as though it's someone speaking, but actually it's someone else. So there's an example of Obama saying things that you couldn't imagine him saying, because it's just been very carefully lip synced by an actor with a very similar voice. Very little progress on regulation. There have been 7 hearings on Capitol Hill since 2018, and it's come to virtually nothing. No substantial change in terms of the number of things being discussed, but haven't come to anything yet. And there's talk about Facebook being too dominant, but actually breaking up the company, and particularly the way they're very tightly integrated, would be an extremely difficult thing to do. So the regulation of social media, I referred to this earlier, the fact that Facebook and the other social media companies are able to claim that they're neutral platforms, they're not publishers. And this section 230 was from the piece of legislation that gives them that protection. And the argument is being made that, well, actually you are moderating because you're deciding who sees what. So you ought to take some responsibility. And obviously that would be a massive, massive overhead to the organization. Antitrust, this is to do with monopolistic behavior, hasn't succeeded so far. The first case was lost. That we're trying to create the same thing in the UK. Federal legislation is weak. You don't have a right to the privacy of your own data the way we do in Europe. There's a new law came out in California. I don't know where that's got to. And the so-called Bill of Rights. I think it's, as I say, it's mooted. It hasn't come to anything yet. So in summary, little progress. So what are my conclusions? Facebook hasn't demonstrated much commitment to change its behavior. Mark Zuckerberg sees himself as a technological visionary. He rebranded the company a couple of weeks ago and called it Meta, and is going to the so-called metaverse, which is basically augmented reality. And that's what his real interest is. There's no real commercial incentive because all his customers love it, because the more we use social media, the more they know about us, the better they can influence our behavior. So only either popular or regulatory pressure is thought to be going to produce anything. And as I said, the regulatory pressure has not done very much so far. Unfortunately, our regulations, and you could say the people who are making the regulations, aren't really quite up to where we are with the digital age. And populist politicians, people like Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi in India, and the Philippines, so Duarte in the Philippines, they're big users of social media. And if voted in through the use of social media, it's very unlikely they're going to want to regulate it. They're just going to continue to fan the flames with the use of social media. Social media hasn't made these political trends, but it's accelerated them. So things like that Trump has managed to tap into, they must have been there. They were latent in the population, but he somehow gave them a voice and gave them a channel through some of the conspiracy theories and groups that were able to be set up and so on. My conclusion, the future remains unclear. Just got a couple of final comments. There's a scary parallel between Trump and Zuckerberg. They're both ambitious and massively, massively competitive in terms of trying to crush the opposition by whatever means. Growth as in popularity for Trump, revenues and share price for Zuckerberg, and they're more important than their business ethics. They didn't intend to create what it is they have done, and Trump wanted to win, but he didn't necessarily want to create the miasma of conspiracy theorists that have been generated by QAnon and the like, but he didn't really care that it did because it helped his ends. They certainly didn't intend that or foresee that it was going to happen, but they were not unhappy with the outcome. Their actions catalyzed the worst traits in human behavior. Yes, there's a lot of good stuff in terms of communicating, but it also gives voice to the darker side of human behavior. The bad news is neither of them is likely to change their nature or to go away anytime soon. 2 final thoughts that might be interesting. You might be interested in this as a little experiment to do at home. Given what I've said, have a look at the ads that you see served up on your system and take a view as to whether you think they're age appropriate. Are they based on your internet searches or perhaps your purchase history, your phone activity, what's your household appliances, reporting information about you, or your travel log? Where did the information, the adverts that you see come from? How do they know to send those ones to you? And if you've got Alexa, another interesting thing to do would be try asking Alexa for a search on something that you've never asked for before, and then see how long it takes before you see an advert, a related advert, pop up on your screen. And a very, very final question, we may not have time to discuss this, it just occurred to me thinking about the South African connection. To what extent was Facebook's behavior comparable to Rhodes's consolidated gold fields in the 1900s? So there you go. I'll leave that on the screen for you to talk about. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. It was a bit of a high-speed rush through. So I hope it didn't feel too much like drinking from a high pressure hose. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very, very much. Fascinating, very provocative presentation. I'm sure we've got lots of questions.
Tim, absolutely astonishing, but I don't think it's new to any of us. I think inwardly, I think we all are so aware that people are elected for spurious reasons, and people are doing things that they don't naturally feel as part of their makeup. So let's just say we all feel intrinsically that we know this is happening.
Yeah.
Now, what is the point of democracy now? Because in fact, what you're really saying to us is that it hasn't existed probably for the past 10, 15 years.
I certainly think it's under threat. I think the first time it really came to prominence in the US was the 2016 election. There was involvement of companies like Cambridge Analytica in the preceding election, but they hadn't really quite got the hang of or realized the potential of the data that they had to influence people's behavior. And they used many other countries. So if you look at again in the references, there's a thing called a video called The Great Hack, which is the expose of Cambridge Analytica, which is well worth watching because they talk in more detail about some of the things they got up to. But I would say it's not quite 10 years, but nonetheless, it certainly would seem to be at risk. And there is concern about that in a number of quarters, certainly in this country. And some of the other things that the governments are doing. The government here are not particularly big users of social media, other than, as I mentioned, kind of using it to do a few things in the shadows. Actually, nothing like Trump in terms of constantly broadcasting comments and observations and abuse. So I'm not sure that's a very good answer, but there's a question mark over the influence it's having for sure. Yeah.
Am I right or wrong? In the elections where mass media, the Rupert group, you could infer you could infer things in the Star or the Sun. Yeah. And by the time it has been poo-pooed, it's too late. And the groundswell of opinion based on fake news or fake advertising in those papers was exactly the same.
Yeah, I think that is undoubtedly true. And until such time as social media is no longer deemed to be a neutral platform, that'll still be the case. It was ever thus. Even before social media, politicians were pretty mendacious anyway, in terms of the claims they would make about how the world worked and what they were going to deliver.
Tim, that's exactly a point I would like to make, that, there is a counter argument that we've got these competing platforms. Yeah. And in our country, I think we've got access to various media platforms that is actually good for democracy. I was very proud of our president in Parliament yesterday, where I thought we had a very gracious acknowledgement of defeat that the government had suffered, and a recognition of shortcomings. And that's how democracy works.
Right.
And, we can become very cynical and depressed about it. I think it's important that governments take these companies to task. The British parliamentarians haven't been very good about it. They've been quite feeble because they're just outsunk by Zuckerberg, who knows more than they do about the industry. So I think there's a huge task ahead for governments to become more tech savvy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There is a bill that's being drafted at the moment relating to online harms. Quite where it's got to, I'm not sure, but I know about it because the whistleblower who I mentioned, Francis Haugen, came and gave evidence to the committee a few weeks ago. So they're plainly aware of what the challenges are, whether they're up to proposing things, because these organizations are so massive and amorphous, and in particularly how do you implement legislation that relates to one country for data that's held in another country or originated somewhere. So there's a whole massive issues to untangle. I know they're trying, and that the person who's the head of that committee is generally thought to have very good cred. He was involved in the phone hacking scandal 10 years previously. So I'm hopeful that that will lead to something, though I agree with you, it's extremely difficult.
Hello, Tim.
Hello, Robin.
The classic English works of fiction about dystopias and dystopian societies that lie in our future, and notably, say, for instance, Orwell's 1984, generally took the view that the society would start to go down the road of state control of the entire media spectrum. And that's how 1984 basically presents the society.
Yeah.
What's happened, in fact, is we've gone in another direction altogether. We're going downhill because of the state's inability to control the media. And well, perhaps I put it more accurately, inability to regulate the media.
Yeah.
And is that the reason why everyone has been taken by surprise? That our trip to a dystopian society is not because of state interference and control, it's because of state lack of interference and control.
Yeah. Yes, I think certainly it's a good observation. It's social media, and it's gone in a different direction because it's commercially driven rather than driven by the will of the government to impose its interpretation of events. And these companies have grown. They're now, particularly Facebook, is so large that it's way beyond the scale of the time in the US when they broke up the telecoms companies or the monopolistic railways or the oil companies. So the challenge is massive. In relation to the government control of the media, I imagine it's the same in South Africa. There are certain newspapers that lean one way and some that lean the other way. The government isn't really directly doing very much about are they? I'm not sure to what extent they're trying to influence the papers more than they were before. But it's social media is the risk, and because it's driven by a commercial incentive rather than a political one, and it's trying successfully to say we're staying out of this. But they're allowing voices to be both played out and amplified through their channels.
It's all very tricky. I have a close relative who never reads a paper,
Right.
or listens to the radio or watches news, depends entirely on his YouTube feed. And it's scary, very scary.
Very, very scary.
Yeah.
Of all the places to go, YouTube would not be the one source to go to.
I've tried to explain how algorithms work and what the danger is, but I've not had any success.
Tim, so take us back now to Brexit. Is it possible in hindsight to do an assessment of what the real state of play of the British voters was in that referendum if social media hadn't played their role?
A lot of the commentary has been partly about social media, but it's also been about the funding, the fact that control of elections had not caught up with social media. So as I mentioned, the fact that the advertising, there's strict limits, financial limits on the amount that can be spent on paper advertising, newspaper advertising. The idea there is to give the smaller parties an opportunity to compete. Otherwise, they just simply get overwhelmed by the larger parties. But there was no regulation in relation to online advertising. So not only were they able to very carefully and neatly micro-target segments of the population, but they were also able to spend huge sums of money, much larger sums of money, and which don't have to be disclosed. So the answer to your question is it possible to predict that? I mean, it was quite a close run thing. It was 48 to 52, and some of the analysis I've seen is that, a bit like any election, it depends on a relatively few constituencies. Sorry, they're not constituencies in that election. It's just areas of the country in which, for whatever reason, the money was poured in terms of particularly advertising and campaigning that made the difference. And there was some relatively small number, I mean, a few 100,000 people needed to change their vote one way or the other to actually influence the outcome. I'm not sure that's a very precise answer, John, but I know what the factors were that influenced it going the way it did go.
both parties were active on social media, so it would be very difficult to unpick all of that.
Yeah, yeah. But there's no doubt that there was Vote Leave and there was Leave UK, and there were several parties which had very similar names, all on the Leave side, which had money coming from really some quite questionable sources, but because they didn't have to be accounted for, it didn't seem to matter particularly. Well, it did matter in terms of the outcome, but there wasn't anything that could be done about it retrospectively in terms of campaign funding.
Taking you back to to your exercise that you made us do, I just want us to look at, for instance, watching Netflix. The other night I got a message saying it's a long time since you've been watching Star Trek. Perhaps you want to see Mission to Mars. So they actually track you to that extent. And so, that makes you realize how you are monitored and watched and analyzed. What is your advice to us today, in terms of arming yourself and to tread carefully in this minefield?
Okay, I think the one thing so that I do personally is I don't use Google. So because Google was first the forerunner and by far and away the most successful at basically monetizing people's behavior. The use of in the very first instance it was AdWords, but then all sorts of other data that is extracted from the searches that you do on Google. So I use a search engine that's not particularly well known. It's called an improbable name, DuckDuckGo. Duck as in quack, DuckDuckGo. And quite what the basis of its business model is, I'm not entirely sure, because you don't pay for the service. But they claim, and I've never heard anyone dispute it, that they don't track you. So they're not selling packages of data about you. So that would probably be the first thing. And the other thing would be, as I said, be extremely cautious about your use on Facebook, your use of Facebook. Now, that'll be a little bit difficult to do retrospectively, because plainly, if you've been using Facebook massively up to now and then change, they will already know a certain amount about you in terms of what data has already been collected. I'm also very cautious about buying things that are connected to the internet. So there's a lot of talk about the connected home, for example. So things like your thermostat, or there's talk about fridges. I don't know whether there are internet connected fridges, your thermostat, your house alarm, and if you have a camera on the at the entrance to your house, those would be examples of things that I would have nothing to do with, because the data would be certainly in relation to the thermostat. The most popular one in this country is Nest, which is owned by Amazon, who will be scooping up the data. There's no question about it, whether you know about it or not. Somewhere in the terms and conditions, you ticked a box that said they could have the data, and it's gone. And I don't use Instagram. I'm very cautious of my use of YouTube, and I only do what I want to do, in the sense I don't let myself get led. Usually, if I'm watching something, I've gone on because I want to watch it, and I'm not looking to see what else it's going to prompt me to do. So it's kind of a controlled use of it, really.
Tim, there is one final question I will allow. It's on the chat box.
It says it's easier to agree than to disagree.
Yeah, going back to the voting about Brexit, it's easier to agree than to disagree. So I think he's asking, if the question had been posed differently, could the answer have been different?
I can't tell you that, but I'm sure a lot of thought went into why the question was phrased the way it was. I must admit, I hadn't really thought about it because it was so long ago, and you just got to accept the result now. But had it been, there was a lot of comments about this. Firstly, it was unnecessary. David Cameron didn't have to do this, and he did it to basically placate the wing of his party. He was very confident, having won 2 elections that people didn't expect him to win, that he would be able to persuade people that. And the other thing he could have done, with hindsight, because it was up to him to determine the rules, he could have made it a super majority as opposed to a straight majority. He could have defined a threshold of, say, 60%. There's a lot of things with hindsight, but basically, crudely, I would say it was hubris on his part. He believed he was a winner, and that he wasn't going to be difficult in persuading people. So it was a big shock. We're still feeling the harm of it now. And will do for some time to come, unfortunately.
For quite some time, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to end the meeting here and just say thank you so much for joining us this morning. It really has been a privilege to link up with you and with Cambridge in this way. Thank you so much.